This is the mortuary temple of Pharaoh Ramesses III, located at Medinet Habu near Luxor, Egypt. Inscribed on the walls of this temple is the earliest archaeological reference to one of the greatest villains in the Hebrew Bible, the Philistines. They're always causing trouble for biblical heroes. They gouge out Samson's eyes before he drops a building on a bunch of them. They steal the Ark of the Covenant from Jerusalem, and they famously lose their champion Goliath in a duel against David. But who were the Philistines, and where did they come from? And what have archaeologists discovered about their culture? Let's turn back to those carvings on the walls of Medinet Habu. This inscription describes a series of attacks up and down the Levantine coast by a coalition of seafaring armies, culminating in an invasion of Egypt in the 1170s BCE. The inscription reads, "The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. No land could stand before their arms. They were coming forward toward Egypt." The inscription then describes the distinct people groups attacking Egypt. Their confederation was the Peleset, the Tejeker, the Shekelesh, the Denian, and the Wesha. And here they are, at least according to the Egyptian artists, a bunch of foreign soldiers with nifty feathered headdresses and distinctly different features compared to the Egyptians. One section of the sculpture depicts Ramses III standing before a dramatic naval battle. Egyptian and invaders' boats crushed together, foreign soldiers falling overboard. Another section depicts the same feathered invaders carried off as prisoners. Scholars now call these people the Sea Peoples. They start appearing in Egyptian sources around 1400 BCE, and by 1100 they apparently were a huge thorn in the side of the Egyptians. A bunch of different primary sources from the New Kingdom period suggest that the Egyptian Empire frequently dealt with Sea People attacks. Now, throughout the 20th century, some scholars even blamed the Sea Peoples as the cause of the so-called Late Bronze Age collapse, an apparently widespread phenomenon when the Eastern Mediterranean region succumbed to a gradual process of political, economic, social, and cultural fragmentation. The superpowers of that time, the Hittite Empire and the Egyptians, were in crisis. The Hittite Empire itself dissolved entirely. Major cities in the Eastern Mediterranean either were destroyed or disappeared. International trade apparently dried up. The argument goes that the Sea Peoples were a primary cause. Invaders from Crete, Cyprus, mainland Greece, and even as far away as Sardinia, coming in and trashing the Levant. However, archaeologists in recent years have modified this Sea Peoples invasion narrative. As with any large-scale historical phenomenon, it's way too simplistic to blame a single cause. The Late Bronze Age collapse was a slow-moving phenomenon that took place over the course of a century or more. In fact, the Sea Peoples might have been victims of the Late Bronze Age collapse themselves, escaping from their homelands as refugees. As the archaeologist Eric Klein argues, we really shouldn't think of the Sea Peoples as waves of organized armies like the Crusades, but probably more like loosely or poorly organized groups. The Egyptian sources, like the mortuary temple of Ramses III, show that these groups apparently had women, children, household goods, and even livestock with them. This motley crew hardly resembles a menacing army. Taken as a whole, the archaeological evidence seems to indicate that some Sea Peoples may have settled the Eastern Mediterranean by force, but others peacefully. So, what does all of this have to do with the Philistines? Well, remember that list of Sea Peoples mentioned at Medinet Habu? Let's focus on the first one mentioned, the Peleset. Or, more accurately, since ancient Egyptian does not have vowels, the PLST. Scholars have identified these people as none other than the Philistines themselves. Not only is the name linguistically related to the name Philistine, another Egyptian source dating to around the same time period locates the Peleset in 3 cities in southern Canaan: Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gaza, cities famously known to be part of the kingdom of Philistia according to the Bible. So, this is the general backstory of the Philistines. They were one of several so-called Sea Peoples, possibly with roots in the Aegean world, maybe Cyprus or possibly southern Anatolia, who migrated to southern Canaan around 1200 BCE, establishing a kingdom based around several major cities, including Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gaza, Gath, and Ekron. But what is the evidence for connecting the Philistines to Aegean cultures? Let's start with the pottery. Remember that pottery is a powerful tool that archaeologists use to date and identify ancient sites, kind of like how we could identify the decade a cell phone belongs to by how it's designed. Archaeologists can link pottery to certain cultures and centuries based on the pottery's style, material, and decorations. And when it comes to the Philistines, archaeologists have discovered Aegean-style pottery at Philistine cities. Check out this photograph. We're looking at an example of Mycenaean 3C pottery, discovered on the Aegean island of Kalymnos. Archaeologists have discovered similar examples in other Aegean sites on Cyprus and mainland Greece. Now, check this out. See any similarities? Light color, dark brown paint? Well, the first picture is an example of Mycenaean 3C pottery from a Greek island. The second example is Mycenaean 3C1 pottery, or more simply nicknamed Philistine monochrome. Yes, this vessel was discovered in the Philistine city of Ekron, so notice the crazy close similarities to Aegean-style pottery. And in fact, archaeologists have discovered Mycenaean 3C1 pottery all over Philistine cities dating to the early Iron Age period. And it was pretty common. At the city of Ekron, for example, Mycenaean 3C1 pottery accounts for somewhere between 40 to 50% of all pottery discovered that dates to the early 12th century. So, what does this tell us about the Philistines and their culture? Archaeologists in the 1970s theorized that the Philistines must have taken this pottery with them from their homelands in the Aegean, or Cyprus itself, when they migrated to their new land. But after studying the pottery using a chemical technique called neutron activation analysis, researchers discovered that these pots were not imports. They were locally produced, created from the same clay found in Philistia itself. In fact, clay with the same chemical fingerprint that we see in later Philistine styles, like Philistine bichrome pottery. So this leads scholars to conclude that the Philistines were making this pottery for themselves, using Aegean-style manufacturing technologies never before seen in the Levant, but not as mere imitators of the style, but as people who migrated to Philistia, carrying with them the technical know-how to continue these styles from a parent culture somewhere in the Aegean world. Here's another example. You're looking at a figurine called an Ashdoda figurine. Basically, she's a female figurine that some archaeologists identify as some sort of Philistine goddess, though in this case, half goddess, half offering table. Archaeologists have discovered similar figurines at major Philistine sites, including Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron, dating to as early as the second half of the 12th century. Now, check out these figurines. Archaeologists call these psi figurines. Because of their elongated necks and raised arms, they look kind of like the Greek letter psi. The examples on the left were found in Greece, Crete, and Cyprus. The example on the right from the Philistine city of Ashdod. Again, we might be looking at evidence of a people that carried with them religious and technical knowledge from the Aegean world to the southern coast of Canaan. What about the Philistine diet? Well, according to archaeological data, Philistines apparently ate pig and dog meat, which reflect the dietary practices of Aegean cultures, but not those living in Canaan. Let's start with the pigs. In the Iron Age 1 period, we see higher frequency of pig bones at Philistine sites compared to neighboring sites. At Ashdod, almost 15% of all bones discovered by archaeologists were pig bones. Iron Age Gath, well, between 13 and 16%. Outside of Philistia, pig bones are much more rare. This may point to higher rates of pork consumption among the Philistines. The theory goes that the Philistines brought pig culture with them from their homelands around the Aegean to the Levantine coast. Analyses of the pig bones found at these sites show that they are genetically related to European pigs. And in fact, wild boars today in Israel and the Palestinian territories are more genetically similar to European boars than those found in surrounding cultures. The Philistines also apparently ate dog meat. While dog bones are a fairly rare find in late Bronze Age Canaanite sites, at the dawn of the early Iron Age, we suddenly see a big spike in dog bones at Philistine sites. And these bones seem to point to evidence of food preparation and consumption. So, for example, archaeologists have noticed cut marks on dog bones that indicate that the Philistines were butchering dogs, and discoloration on the bones implies that they were roasting the meat. Again, this might point to their Aegean origins. Eating dogs was a known practice in mainland Greece, Crete, and the Aegean world in general. Archaeologists have found butchered dog bones all over the Aegean region, dating from the Neolithic period all the way into the Classical period. And finally, Philistine DNA may also point to European origins. A team of archaeologists extracted and analyzed DNA from 10 individuals buried in the Philistine city of Ashkelon. These skeletons date to the Late Bronze Age and the Early Iron Age, the same time period when the so-called Sea Peoples were thought to have showed up in this region. The researchers published their result in 2019, which showed that the DNA from these individuals exhibits specific European patterns, similar DNA patterns that we see in southern Europeans in Italy, the Aegean, and southern Spain. This might suggest that the early Philistines were indeed immigrants from southern Europe, and specifically the cultures around the Aegean Sea. Though we should proceed with caution here. This study makes some pretty bold claims based on a very small sample size of 10 individuals. But taken together, the figurines, the pottery, the diet, and the DNA all point to roots in the Aegean world. But of course the origins of the Philistines are more complicated than a simple narrative of a one-way migration to Canaan. Archaeologists over the past decade argue that the Philistines were not a single ethnicity that invaded, destroyed, and replaced the Canaanites. Rather, as the archaeologist Aaron Mayer argues, they appear to have been a multicultural people comprised of various groups deriving from the eastern and central Mediterranean that joined with local Canaanites to form a unique culture. He argues it is better to describe the Philistines as an entangled society. A society with Aegean roots, but entangled in Canaanite culture. Okay, so that's the archaeological data, but let's now return to the Bible, the textual sources. How does the biblical description of Philistines jibe with the archaeology? And more specifically, what does the Bible have against the Philistines? The Bible mentions the Philistines over 250 times, and from the book of Genesis to the book of Judges, and all the way up through the books of Samuel and Kings, the story is basically the same. Near constant tension between the Philistines and their neighbors. But was there really historical tension between the Philistines and the Israelites during the time periods that these books were thought to cover? These are tricky questions to answer because most biblical scholars today agree that the texts containing the most dramatic stories about the Philistines were composed or redacted centuries later, probably during the 7th or 6th centuries BCE. In other words, hundreds of years after the period that the famous stories of Samson or King David were thought to have happened. Because of this, scholars need to identify what parts of the Hebrew Bible preserve actual memories of Iron Age Philistia, and what parts reflect the political situation of later centuries. There are basically two sides of the argument. Israel Finkelstein, one of the most prominent archaeologists of this region over the past few decades, has argued that the biblical references to the Philistines do not contain any memory of early Iron Age events or cultural behavior. Let's take the city of Gath as a case study, famously the hometown of the giant Goliath. It is the most frequently mentioned Philistine city in the book of Samuel, and many of the battles between the Israelites and the Philistines take place east of the city. But decades of excavations in and around the site of Gath, also called Tel Asafi, have revealed no evidence of hostility between the Philistines and their neighbors to the east. The biblical scholar Daniel Pioski writes that for a period of around 3 centuries, we find no clear evidence that forces from Gath ever attacked or destroyed a single location within the neighboring regions of Israel or Judah, or conversely that it was attacked by individuals from these areas during this time. In fact, the archaeological record seems to indicate the opposite was true, as there's evidence that Gath was actively engaging in economic and cultural exchange with its neighbors to the east. The Philistine religion is another possible example of archaeology telling a different story than the text. The Bible suggests that the main Philistine god was a male god named Dagon. But the most common religious paraphernalia that we find in Philistine sites are those female figurines that we mentioned earlier, and the mention of a female goddess on an inscription found in the Philistine city of Ekron, which suggests that the main god was a goddess, not Dagon. On the other side of the coin, some archaeologists and biblical scholars do argue that the stories about the Philistines in the books of Samuel or Kings might contain kernels of actual data about Iron Age Philistines. So, for example, the very fact that the Bible mentions Gath so often is interesting because while the city was one of the biggest cities around the 10th century, Gath apparently dwindled in importance in later periods. Excavations at Tel Asafi have demonstrated that the city was destroyed by fire in the 9th or 8th century and never fully recovered. So this leads the ancient historian Itamar Singer to argue that the Hebrew Bible includes at least a memory of Iron Age Philistia, even if the text includes some pretty obvious anachronisms. Overall, the Philistines are the subject of some of the most recent and cutting-edge archaeological studies. Archaeologists discovered a major Philistine cemetery only a few years ago. Their DNA has been sequenced in detail, but a lot of their culture and society remain a mystery to this day. If you'd like to learn more about the Philistines, I'm including a bibliography in the description below, as well as links to excavations at Tel Asafi, Ashkelon, and Ekron. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next episode. Hey everyone, that was episode 4 of Patheos' new series, Excavating the History of the Bible. Click on the link on screen to watch the first 3 episodes, and stay tuned for episode 5, Iron Age Jerusalem.